ask you guys a question. If I was to use kind of a simple economic equation of supply and demand, if you think in your own lives, what is in the highest of demand but shortest of supply? What would you say? Shout it out. Time, yes, time is always the #1 answer, because time is becoming the #1 leverageable value proposition today. When we think of time and our notion of time, time is something that is rapidly speeding up. It is accelerating. It is something that we are looking to manipulate, modify, control, amplify. And one of the things that we see is that time and the way in which we once measured it was always measured more geometrically. But today, and for me as a futurist, one of the things that I'm always looking at is that accelerating rate of change. Time is now going from something that was once geometrically measured to something that is now being measured exponentially. So much of what needs to happen is happening on the local level, but so much of what is happening today is also driven by the exponential rate of technological change. Now, let me just say something about trends. One of the things that we always think about is that when a new trend comes to fruition or a new technology comes to fruition, it will always replace that which came before. But it's always important to remember that it's about trend and counter-trend, and the counter-trend doesn't happen in spite of the trend, it happens because of the trend. And when we look at everything that's happening now today, when it comes to sustainability and the future of the food movement, it really is about things that used to be as two seemingly disparate opposites. It's technology being married with what's happening at the human-based, more local level. So in our shop, and again, as a futurist, I'm in the business of making up new words, and one of the terms I have for what's happening is something that I call templosion. Now, templosion, very simply put, is the implosion of the biggest of things, the biggest of events, into smaller and smaller chunks of time. What we are seeing is the rapid truncation of time. So things that used to take years or decades to come to fruition or be created are now being created much more quickly. And this is having a direct impact on everything we're seeing with not just sustainability, but truly the future of food. And when we look at a world of templosion, it is quickly catapulting us into an entirely new economy and an entirely new era of production. That the old industrial models of how we used to create new goods, new products, new services, is now completely antiquated for the world in which we are moving into. So as we look at and define this new economy, one of the major growth areas that's going to define the future is something that in our shop we call green to blue space. Very simply, it describes a spectrum of activity that goes from doing green to being green to ultimately being blue. Now, let's take each one individually, look at where we started, and then ultimately, let's look at where we are going. Doing green, in many ways, is an outdated model of sustainability, but we are still playing there. Companies today are still very stuck there. And doing green is now a need to have versus a nice to have. Every company today has to have some sort of corporate social responsibility program in place in order to court the consumer. Consumers are demanding organic goods, toting around their reusable bags. It now has become the playing field. It's where you need to be to compete. However, as I said, this is not the future. This, in many ways, is an outmoded structure. So as we continue along the spectrum, it starts becoming a little bit more interesting as we then move to being green. Now, very simply, what is being green? Being green really is a much more holistic framework. It's about holistically and successfully, and most importantly, authentically, leveraging the value proposition, the true value proposition of being green, and for any company, any startup, whatever it is, truly making being green an intrinsic guiding principle. Now, what do I mean by this? In many ways, the way in which we think of the current supply chain, again, operates within an old industrial model. But this is really looking at the entire 360. It's looking at how the product was produced, with what materials, where, how it was shipped, what is the labor that went into it, how it was consumed on the part of the consumer, what was done with the packaging. Basically, it's taking what used to be a very cradle-to-grave sort of concept and embracing a cradle-to-cradle concept. And this is very difficult for a lot of people to do, to make that transition from doing to being, because the real innovation and the real imagination is exclusively pivoting around what we call blue. Many companies will even leapfrog being green and go directly to blue itself. We call this blue because it's the color of the Earth as seen from space, but blue is really about putting back more into not just the environment, but the entire ecosystem. And it's about putting back more than you took from it in the first place. And much of this is spearheading a lot of the imaginative, not just technologies, but a lot of the imaginative advances that are happening with both sustainability and the food movement. So let's tick through some examples. The first is everything happening with urban, near urban, both vertical and subterranean farming. As many of you in this room know, we are very quickly running out of arable land. And now that we are faced with a future where 60 to 65% of people by 2030 are going to be living in cities, and that is not just in the developed world, that is primarily going to be marked in the developing world. So how they grow their food, how they have access to it, and how they have access to it in an organic and even a hydroponic, aquaponic sort of way, this is really going to define our cities in the future. Many things that we're seeing right here in our own backyard, for instance, the rise of rooftop gardens. Many old dilapidated buildings, instead of being torn down and creating new farms, they're being retrofit to grow new food. And again, because so many people are going to be living in cities, this is also going to be critical. But when we think of our buildings in the future, we often, again, think of them in an industrial era model. But increasingly, food and food driven by advances in synthetic biology are going to create living structures. So we're going to move away from wood and steel and all of these very cumbersome materials and look to the innate properties of food itself to inspire, design, and create our architecture that will grow our food in the future. So it's looking at the properties of everything from milk and casein to eggshells to inspire bone-like materials, where we're seeing the merger between biology and engineering to create an entirely different future. Another example, this is a prototype called the Jellyfish Lodge. This is a very cool example because this not only uses biology as an inspiration, but really biomimicry. And it takes its inspiration from the jellyfish, and it has tentacles that can go into the water, use that water, purify it, use it to grow organic food. And then the benefit, and the blue benefit to the community, is that they can take part reaping the benefits of that food, but also take care of the system itself. There's actually a town in the UK that is using food waste to create new forms of energy, and they hope that 80% of that energy will come from food waste. So we're going to see more communities looking to sustainable ways of powering themselves and dealing with the food waste issue. A very cool example, edible drones. This is really tackling what's happening in the developing world. This drone is fully blue. It comes fully packaged with food. The packaging itself can be used in shelters, and the structure of the drone is made of wood, so you can break it down into kindling and then use it to build a fire to cook the food that's inside the drone. So 100% of this is being used by the local community. Last example of blue, edible packaging. We know that not just food waste, but plastic waste is a huge, huge issue. This is the Saltwater Brewery in Delaware, Florida, and they took the scraps, the barley and yeast from their beer production, and created an edible six-pack. So when discarded of, it not just goes into the ocean, but it breaks down and provides food for marine life. So those are some quick examples of blue, and I love ending on this quote, because I know I threw a lot out at you guys, but if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I always make this point because it really highlights the difference between innovation and imagination. So innovation largely is about straight-line extrapolation based on what we think we know, where we think the future is moving. But increasingly, we need to think about imagination. And imagination, as you go throughout your day-to-day, hear all of these amazing things from amazing people about the future of food, we need to think in terms of imagination, as that is exclusively where we're going to be, where we need to play. So thank you.